Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Region 8 Places of Worship Security Resources webinar brought to you by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA Region 8. The purpose for this event is to share security resources and services available to places of worship for strengthening security and promoting resilience for our faith-based communities. And we're pleased to have you join us. My name is Tim Rudeman. I serve as the Regional Outreach Coordinator for CISA Region 8. And before we begin, I will cover a few admin notes. Please remain muted during the presentation and avoid turning on your camera if you can. You can use the chat to post questions and comments during the presentation, and we'll also share some documents there. And we'll have a question and answer opportunity after the conclusion of each presentation. Feel free to post those questions like I mentioned, and when we get to the breaks after the individual presentations, we can have you use the hand raise function as part of the menu. There should be along the top for you, and we'll call on you as those come up. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides will be shared with those that registered, those of the presentations that are approved for distribution. And a link to the recording will be available to share in the near future, to share with those unable to join us tonight. Here to provide opening remarks is the CISA Region 8 Regional Director, Sean Groff.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Tim. Tim, can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Hey, great. Well, welcome, everybody, and thanks for attending tonight's webinar. As Tim mentioned, I'm the Regional Director for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency here in Region 8. You can kind of see the 6 states that covers up in the corner of the slide, but I understand there may be people from across the country attending, and we welcome you all. We have similar capabilities across the country in every region, and so you'll have sort of the same resources that are talked about today in your neck of the woods. So again, welcome and thanks for joining us. A big part of our mission as the nation's cyber defense agency and coordinator for critical infrastructure is helping folks understand and manage risk both to their cyber and physical infrastructure. Currently, we're in something for October, something called Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And during that month, we're talking to folks about how we can work collectively to secure our world in the cyberspace. We talk about really 4 different things that everyone and every organization can do to increase your cybersecurity posture. Thinking before you're clicking, using strong passwords, enabling multi-factor authentication, and updating your software programs. Next month, we'll be shifting for November to Critical Infrastructure Security Awareness Month. And part of that focus includes building resilience across all the sectors of our shared lives as Americans. This includes awareness of what's happening outside of the United States and how that may impact us here at home. Currently, we do not have specific and credible intelligence indicating a threat to the United States at this time, but a factor in risk management is really understanding that terrorist organizations and their supporters are committed to attacking the United States within and beyond our borders. These actions can include targeting of individuals, houses of worship, and institutions associated with Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and really any faith-based organization through physical assault, acts of vandalism, or just simple harassment. With all of that in mind, we're actively monitoring the situation in Israel and currently focused on 3 lines of effort. 1, providing support to our international partners, tracking and responding changes in the cyber and physical threat landscapes in the United States, and then engaging and supporting domestic faith-based organizations and other communities that may be at higher risk at this time. That brings us to the purpose of tonight's webinar. We all know that the cyber and physical hazards that we're facing are increasingly widespread, sometimes global in nature, meaning our individual and organizational resistance are really woven together with that of our neighbors, our businesses, and even where we worship. Every member of our community, so family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, we all act as that first line of defense in keeping the public safe and secure. Education and awareness, a lot of what tonight is about, are critical in identifying and reporting suspicious behavior so that we can stop violence before it happens. we at CISA recognize the power that a single individual can have in deterring threats. Thanks again. Thank you for joining us tonight to learn how we can really build resilience together to protect our houses of worship. At the end of the webinar tonight, I'm hoping you're going to come away thinking about how to work within your organization, your community, to really deliberately focus on a few things. One, knowing, understanding the risks that you may have, making a plan, and then exercising that plan within your community, within your facility. Security, we like to say, is a team sport. We are really all in this together. So again, thank you all for attending tonight. And with that, I will turn it back over to Tim.
Thank you, Artie Groff. Next, I'll introduce Tiffany Sewell, the Associate Director, Center of Field Operations. Before we get into that, here's a quick look at the schedule for tonight in case you didn't get to review the agenda. We'll have a handful of presentations available for you, starting with Tiffany, as I mentioned, and we'll talk some protective security, bomb threat management, follow that up with cybersecurity resources before we close out the evening. And here you go, Tiffany, Associate Director, Center of Field Operations, DHS Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. So over to you, Tiffany, while I bring up your slide set.
Thank you so much for having me. So the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships is a little different than some other agencies, as our entire focus is on how do we prevent targeted violence and terrorism from happening. And we take a public health informed approach in order to do that. Next slide, please. So really, to get into what is the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, really what we do is we provide funding, training, and increase public awareness about partnerships across every level of government, whether that's the private sector, houses of worship, local communities. And really our long-term goal is that we will have a safer America, safer communities within America, so that through these prevention programs, we build at the community level. Next slide. So what is a public health informed approach? Really, it treats reducing targeted violence and terrorism the same way that it would treat youth violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, any sort of violence that happens across the United States. They have what we call the same risk and protective factors. So it really is a combination of psychological, sociological, and political elements that come together. And rather than making it a criminal issue, how do we stop it before it actually happens? So like usually when a issue of violence happens, it's because they have a grievance against something. So how do we stop that grievance from happening? A public health informed approach is about how do we build protective factors within communities to prevent these grievances from happening. Next slide, please. So first things first is we really need to understand what is targeted violence. And really it is a premeditated act of violence that's directed at a specific individual based on a group or location, regardless of what the motivation is, and it violates a criminal law. So it's an act of violence against a group because of something that they're associated with. When you hear the word terrorism, a lot of people go back and think of 9/11, and actually terrorism is bigger than that. It is really domestic terrorism is what is one of our biggest issues here in the homeland. Next slide, please. So we talk about international terrorism, which of course people think back to 9/11 or things that are happening today across the country. But really our biggest threat to America is domestic terrorism. And that is radically motivated anti-government people that have a grievance against a specific group of people because of something they believe or something they're associated with. Next slide. So what is the problem? So during the 5-year period from 1990 to 1994, we averaged about 2 mass casualties per year regarding targeted violence. In comparison, from 2017 to 2021, we're averaging around 40 mass casualties per year in the United States. That's a 19 100% increase. So despite all of the things that we did around counterterrorism in the post 9/11 era, the individuals associated with extreme ideologies were successful in continuing to commit these acts of violence. So we have to do something different. And that's why we have taken on the public health informed approach. Next slide, please. So we call this the cliff effect. And I like to start down at the bottom of this cliff effect, which is we're focusing on the social determinants of health with primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So if we start at tertiary prevention, I like to give the example of, let's say you fall off of a cliff, you want an ambulance to get there as quickly as possible. So if an act of violence does happen, we want to bring the person in who committed that act of violence. They're going to maybe go to prison or jail or whatever that may look like, but eventually they will get out. What are we doing to shore up that individual, wrap services around them so they don't continue to have another act of violence? That's what we call tertiary prevention. So we want to keep recidivism from happening, reintegrate them back into the community so that they don't ever commit these acts again. And I say, can't we do better than that? Can't we do better than that? And so that's why we have this net that's midway down the cliff. And that's what we call secondary prevention. So that's where we start to put into place in communities, and this is where houses of worship can come into play, is behavioral and threat assessments and management teams. So let's say we recognize an individual and say, you know what, something just seems a little off with them. How could we help them? How can we do something differently? Maybe they're isolating, maybe they're just a lot of things have changed for them. And you notice it and somebody else notice it. And then we put into place a behavioral and threat assessment where we wrap services around them so they actually never commit that act of violence because we've provided services for them. So for example, we know a risk factor is being isolated. So how do we connect that person to some sort of positive person within the community so they don't commit that act of violence? And then we say, can't we do better than that? And that's where we build this fence at the edge of the cliff, which we call primary prevention. And that is really where we're putting programs in place at the community level so they actually never get to that place where they have that grievance. So a job program, bystanders awareness, shoring up communities so that we don't have this social injustice that happens within communities. What are the programs that we can put in place to build that fence so that they don't ever fall off the cliff? And then that one step before that, and through the social determinants of health, is let's move our communities back from that wall to begin with. So how do we get people engaged in programs? How do we get people engaged with houses of worship that wouldn't typically come? How do we engage communities differently and better so that they come when they are needing help and support? So that's really what our public health informed approach looks like through primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Next slide, please. So we have to understand the factors around that influence violence. So if we talk about societal, community, relationship, and individuals, so a lot of times they will have a societal grievance against, let's say, the government or a certain community based on religion. And so how do we change that so that they aren't having that grievance to begin with? The second thing is community. How do we engage them in the community level so that they feel connected in a way that this is their community and they have some sense of belonging within their community? And then the second, and these two are probably the most important, is the individual and relationship level. The Surgeon General just released a report that says that being isolated and alone and not being connected is comparable to smoking 29 cigarettes per day. And so it has the same physical and mental health effects as smoking cigarettes. And so how do we get them connected with a positive relationship or help them build up their individual strengths? Next slide, please. So identifying risk factors and risk and protective factors. So what is a risk factor? A risk factor is really something that may increase something that makes you susceptible to violence. So whether that is that you've been exposed to violence before, which is a big risk factor. So let's say when you were a young person and there was domestic violence in your home, that is considered a risk factor. So those are the risk factors we really have to look at and understand that we need to build in protective factors for them to address some of those risk factors. The number one protective factor that we can do is connect people with other people, whether that's connecting a young person to a caring adult or whether that's connecting one caring adult to another caring adult. So creating friendships, creating programs where they feel like they belong, increasing self-esteem, having a job where they feel like they belong and that they're part of something. Next slide, please. So these are prevention and intervention levels at the community level. So what are the steps that we can take as a community, as a house of worship? What can we do? So if we implement community-wide policies that are ways of engaging communities different than we have, maybe we open our doors longer, maybe we do community events differently, but it really empowers people to feel connected in a way that they haven't felt connected before, or seeing a lot of times when an incident of violence happens, it's because they dehumanize the other individual. So how do we make it so that they understand that we all are individuals, we all are humans, and we have the same basic needs? We of course can conduct threat assessments, and we can connect you with people in our office that do and create threat assessments, and then of course rehabilitation. Next slide, please. So our approach to community-led interventions, this is some of what I just said. Next slide, please. Prevention providers. So how do we do this? We do this through prevention providers. And really, when we use the word prevention providers, that could be anybody. That could be a school counselor. That could be a teacher. It could be probation officer, somebody that's part of a behavioral and threat assessment team member. Anybody who sees a risk factor within their community that is willing to say, I'm worried about this person. How do we get them the services that we need? Next slide, please. So at the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, we have field staff that want to help you do this. And so I am, of course, the star that's in Colorado. I am the Associate Director of Field Operations, and I cover region 7 and 8 and half of 6 in the green areas. And of course, I would be happy to talk with any of you about how we start creating these prevention programs. We do have 18 field staff, which are all of the little black dots across the map, as well as 4 associate directors of field operations in each of the colors. So next slide, please. One way that we do that is we provide a grant program. So we have $50 million with 87 recipients across the United States to create prevention programs. This is for small, mid-sized, and large communities where we award grants based on how can you affect targeted violence and terrorism in your own community. Next slide, please. We also have what's called Invent to Prevent. This is a program that we give high schools, middle schools, and colleges money in order to give to the young people to say, what can you do in your school in order to help prevent targeted violence and terrorism? So a lot of times it is creating a buddy program. That's something that worked last year. We had one of our HBCUs win last year, and it really was every incoming freshman was partnered with another person so that they felt connected in their school. And really, the young people are so smart and so innovative, and they create these programs, and it really can be anything. And so it's a year-long project that we give them money to create, and then the winner gets to go to Washington, D.C. and present their program. Next slide, please. On our website, which is a link to at the bottom of this page, we have a prevention resource finder. So no matter where you are in the US, you can go onto this website and find prevention resources in your community. Next slide, please. More information. So this is specifically about protecting houses of worship. And this slide has links to different trainings that we have, different landing pages that we have across the Department of Homeland Security. And there's two slides, slide 17 and slide 18, that give you resources for how to protect your faith-based house of worship. Next slide. And next slide. And here is my contact information, and I'm happy to help you connect with any of those resources as well. I have not had a chance to look at the chat yet. Is there any questions that I can answer in the next 2 minutes of my time left?
Thank you, Tiffany. I do not see any questions yet in the chat for you. If anyone would like to come off mute and ask a question of Tiffany here before she departs for the evening, please let us know.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you. And just to clarify, Tiffany, your slides, a PDF version, is that shareable?
These slides are still within our clearance process, but they should be available within the next week, which I will send to you, and then we can send them out to folks.
Okay, I'll wait for your approval before I send these out with the other materials to those that registered. Thank you again.
So much.
I don't see any follow-up questions. Some hand claps for you there. Appreciate it. And with that, I will move on to Jory Mays, our Chief of Protective Security for CISA Region 8. And I'll have your slides up in a moment.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks, Tiffany. That was a great presentation, and certainly you're a great partner to us here at CISA. So for the next 15 to 20 minutes, I am going to be talking about protecting houses of worship and specifically security resources and how to get started. I know a lot of folks that are on this call may be a variety of sizes of houses of worship or places of worship. So what we're going to give you today, I think, will be resources that anyone can use. Next slide. And so we're going to cover 6 things. We're going to cover how do you understand your risk, how do you implement protective measures, how to develop and exercise a plan that you have, how do you inform and educate greeters and members of your community to recognize and report suspicious behavior. We're going to talk a little bit about sources for grants, and then lastly, how to report hate crimes and other incidents. Next slide. Okay, so the first and most important thing I think that we're going to talk about is how to get started, and that is really creating a security team. This involves really pinning a rose on either yourself or a leader that you know can coordinate and lead the team. Jennifer, it looks like you're off mute. Thanks. And we are going to talk about how to do that. So typically, when you are planning a team, you're going to need a security coordinator, a security planning team, and then really trying to get a safety team put together. So this will include greeters, volunteers, and folks that really have eyes on and looking out and across not only your facility internally, externally, and then in the community with your neighbors. Next slide. So first, we have to understand the risk. All security really is in context to risk. And how do you do that? So there are a number of places where you can get what we call threat information, right? That can be locally. That can be connecting with a local security group and your neighbors. If you don't have one, you can start one. It can be connecting with local law enforcement to find out whether or not you have a security group or if they'd be interested in partnering with you. And they will have sources of threat information that you can sign up for. You can look to DHS and other publications that I'll share with you, and other nonprofit or organizations that can start to give you intelligence and information specifically about what the threat landscape looks to places of worship. And finally, you can perform a self-assessment to determine the vulnerabilities that you have in context to that risk. Next slide. So here's how you can stay informed. Every state has a state fusion center. That's a place where federal, state, and local and often private sector comes together to share information and issue advisories. We have the link to the National Terrorism Advisory System in the bulletins that are put out there. There is an organization called the Faith-Based Information Sharing and Analysis Organization, and they put out great information that's very timely and actionable. The Secure Community Network, Faith-Based Security Network. If HISN has a few pages that are available for faith-based networks, and then also you've got typically some local organizations where interfaith communities can come together to share threat intelligence. Next slide. I will say you will get the slide deck. So if you're fervently writing down some of these links, you will have them and accessible to you, hyperlinked in these slides when you get it. But here are some resources to mitigate these threats. Once you start getting this information, you're going to say, what do I do about that? So you'll have lots of things from our CISA.gov website, and that's CISA.gov. And so looking at this slide, you'll see, a mitigating attacks on houses of worship security guide that is really comprehensive. So when you do get the slide deck, I encourage you to really explore some of these resources. Next slide. And the self-assessment tool. This is an opportunity for you to really use an interactive tool with your security team to really find out kind of where you sit and then how to prioritize some of the security measures you find that you need. You will have an opportunity to review best practices that other houses of worship have implemented, and then look to develop possible investment justifications and further mitigation measures. So this is a great tool for you to kind of rack and stack and understand what you'll need to do, and kind of the position that your security team will want to develop. Next slide. I want to say one really important thing, and one really important thing here is understanding leadership intent inside of your organization. I've been doing this a long time, and what I found is that there are really two ends of the spectrum. You'll have leadership that says we want to be highly secure and put out an environment, a real strong message of security. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you'll have leadership that says, absolutely not. We want an open, welcome, inviting environment and we don't want to lock our doors. So before the team gets started, I would say it's really important to have that hard conversation about the culture, the culture of security and the tolerance that you have within the leadership in your organization. And that really can turn into a lot of questions about really what is the threat and what can we do that everyone's comfortable with. I would encourage you to have that conversation very early because I think it really will set the trajectory of your security team. The self-assessment tool that I mentioned that's on our CISA.gov website, and you will have the link to that, will help kind of guide you through some of the mitigation measures and protective measures that you see here. So that can just look like signage, making sure your CCTV systems are working, restricting high-speed avenues of approach, and really training everybody that is willing to participate in keeping your house of worship safe. There'll be quite a few options for you to consider as you move through your self-assessment. Next slide. Okay, the next piece is really to understand your space. So we look at security as defense in depth. We want you to look at the outer, middle, and inner areas and really focus on safety for children, and build a culture of security and resilience within your congregation or the folks that you have visiting your space. Next slide, please. Actually, could you go back a slide? I'm sorry. So I mentioned children, and we have this K through 12 school security guide training companion. That link you can find on CISA.gov as well. And so that really helps you understand how you may protect the children within your building and have specific practices for children. Next slide. The next piece is developing a plan. And before you do this, I would say when you're thinking about the members of your team, it's important to recognize that you need a variety of folks. A lot of times when we're talking about how to build a team, the first thought is let's invite members from the law enforcement community in. And I think that's a great idea. But really, to build an effective plan, you have to have the right members of your team. And that means that they have to be diverse. So you might think about somebody who's great at writing grants. You might think about someone who is a K through 12 teacher or faculty. You may think about the diversity of the group because people view security differently depending on who they are. And lastly, you might consider folks with access and functional needs and their perspective on building a security plan, because they may add some context and thought that the rest of the group may not have experienced. And I always say, who is the most important person on your security team to create a plan? And the answer, it's the person you forgot. You have to remember and always think about, is someone's perspective missing? Because that would be the hole in your plan. So I think you really have to spend critical time thinking about who exactly you would have on that team, and remember to continue to think about that as you're building a plan. So having a security plan is important, a written defensible security plan, and also an emergency action plan. And that will help you to document the steps that all personnel and volunteers are going to take to respond to an incident. Here are a variety of links to documents that will help you write that plan. And I think this is all different perspectives. Next slide. Okay, and the next thing you do is practice the plan. So once you have a plan and you've got the folks identified that are part of the plan, the next thing to do is practice that. And here at CISA, we have a tabletop exercise package for faith-based organizations. And I'll tell you what, this is a really great guide for you to practice what you've come up with. And by doing so, you're going to find some things in the plan worked and some didn't. And maybe there are elements that you need to continue to build inside of your plan. So practicing this at least annually is going to really help people develop muscle memory in case there's an incident and they need to move through the plan. Next slide, please. Okay, and the next piece is how to inform and educate greeters. And I think about the word greeters, you've got folks, these are the eyes and ears, but there's a lot of other folks that you might choose to really inform and educate on really what is suspicious and what isn't. It'd be great to involve law enforcement in this process. You might consider inviting neighbors and other members who are regularly attending services, because the more eyes and ears that understand what to look for, the better. I'm gonna go through these 8 things very quickly. Some of the suspicious behaviors are expressed or implied threats of violence, prolonged interest in taking pictures of people or infrastructure, loitering, placing objects or packages in a concealed or hidden manner, posting personally identifiable information online with intent to harm, harass, or intimidate, trying to enter a restricted area without authorization, and potentially asking specific questions about business functions or security, or intentionally avoiding security personnel or systems. Next slide. We've got a couple things available to you also on our website, and one is Power of Hello. When you see suspicious activity, what do you do? Obviously, if it's something that is threatening behavior, then you have to call 911. But first, can you observe your surroundings, initiate a hello, and try to deter this potential threat? Next, how do you navigate the risk? And you're evaluating it, right? So determining if it's threatening or suspicious, and if needed, you obtain help. Next slide. Coupled with this, we have a de-escalation training and series, how to recognize, assess, de-escalate, how exactly to do that, and how to report the suspicious behavior. This is also available on CISA.gov with a lot of resources on de-escalation. I think this is important in today's threat environment. Next slide. This is an example of what you'll find in the de-escalation series. Just here, remain calm, change the setting, respect personal space, that down to words and sentences that you can use to start to de-escalate. Instead of telling somebody to calm down, saying something, I can see that you are upset. And that's very validating. So I would really encourage you to go to CISA.gov, look up de-escalation. This is something you can use at any part of your life, but certainly in a house of worship. Next slide. Okay, and we're going to go over a couple grants. So you'll have links to several grants, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. You'll understand the State Homeland Security Grant Program. Next slide. Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program that Tiffany mentioned, and several other grant opportunities. In the slide deck, you'll be able to look and see what you may be eligible for or interested in, and certainly you can contact CISA if you have more questions about some of these grants that might be available. Next slide. And last, I want to say report hate crimes and other criminal incidents that occur in your house of worship. First step is local law enforcement. They can action that and help you. And also reporting to the FBI for us to kind of understand the bigger threat picture so that we can share that out on webinars just like this. Next slide, please. Okay, so you will have our contact information, and you'll have our slides with a lot of resources. And with that, I'd like to ask if anyone has some questions. Please come off mute, or Tim, if there's anything in the chat.
Thank you, Jory. I am not seeing any questions posted in the chat.
Okay.
And do not see any hands raised at this point. We'll give it another moment. Got some clapping for you though. So appreciate the presentation, Jory.
Okay. Well, thanks to everybody to join. I know we're giving you a tremendous amount of information, links, resources, and it's going to be a lot to go through. But you'll be able to find all of the things that I presented on CISA.gov. So I encourage you to explore our webpage. Thanks.
Thank you, Jory. And next up, we have Scott Davis, Supervisory Protective Security Advisor for CISA Region 8. I will pull up your slides here momentarily.
Sounds good. Thanks, Tim. Hey, good evening, everybody. As Tim said, my name's Scott. So I'm the Supervisory Protective Security Advisor assigned here within CISA Region 8. I am fortunate enough to live up in the great state of South Dakota, which is currently about 21 degrees and snowing out. So joining you tonight, I appreciate everybody being on. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to come in and talk to you tonight about some of the CISA programs and resources. I'm going to talk specifically about bomb threat management. We have seen a rise or a rash increase in bomb threats at houses of worship and other facilities across the nation recently. And so the idea behind this was to be able to deliver this type of training to you so that you guys can go out and build a plan and practice that plan as Dory talked about, and then also, you know, understand what is the difference between a suspicious device and a unattended item. So I'm going to turn off my camera as I go through this. I have a few videos. The slides are a little bit heavy, so I don't want to use up too much bandwidth where you guys wouldn't be able to watch something. So I will be come back on video once I get done with this. Next slide, Tim. So quick table of contents. So we're going to talk tonight about what an actual improvised explosive device is, which is the most common type of bomb or bomb threat that we have here in the United States. We're going to talk about the impacts of bomb threats and their potential to disrupt communities and organizations. We're going to talk about the importance of bomb threat planning and the elements of a bomb threat or emergency response plan. We're going to talk about the steps involved in responding to bomb threats and suspicious items, including how do you evaluate a threat and select a course of action, and how to distinguish between suspicious and unattended items. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about protective measures, both physical and procedural, that facilities can have in place to protect and prevent against the impact of bomb threats. Next slide, please, Tim. So what is an IED? The term IED refers to improvised explosive device, which is defined as a device placed or fabricated in an improvised manner, incorporating destructive, lethal, noxious, pyrotechnic, or incendiary chemicals, and designed to destroy, incapacitate, harass, or distract. And they can be disguised as anything. You know, during the height of the Iraq War that the U.S. was involved in, IEDs were made into curbs. So you could have anything from a styrofoam cup to a curb to, a pressure cooker like what we saw up in Boston during the Boston Marathon bombing. So they can be disguised or look like any ordinary item. We do talk about, you can go to the next slide, Tim, sorry. We do talk about some of the common things that we see in IEDs. And you can remember this, the acronym SIMC, pronounced SIMC, for recalling the elements of an IED. And all IEDs, all bombs, are going to have these items. And so there's a switch, an initiator, a main charge, a power source, the container itself, and then enhancements. And then, like I said, they can look like anything out there. Next slide, please, Tim. So what are we actually talking about when we talk about the global IED threat? So it is still, and has been for a long time, and still the choice of terrorists. And that includes, like what Tiffany talked about earlier, both domestic violent extremists and foreign terrorist organizations. The use of IEDs is becoming increasingly sophisticated and transnational as terrorist organizations adapt their tactics to suit today's global security situation, from shoe bombs to printer cartridges bombs to underwear bombs. As we take measures to counter threats, adversaries are evolving their tactics through observation, trial and error, and the exchange of information over the internet and social media. This administration and the intelligence community have stated that because the knowledge and materials needed to construct an IED are easily accessible, these weapons are likely to remain the weapon of choice into the foreseeable future. A general consensus within the national security community agrees that operational tactics among terrorist groups are shifting away from centrally planned and coordinated efforts such as Al-Qaeda. Instead, actions are increasingly being taken by lone wolves who are inspired by, but taking only loose guidance from extremist groups. This shift is likely to reduce interdiction and disruption opportunities of traditional law enforcement and intelligence capabilities. The shift will drive the need to arm a greater portion of the first responders, LE, fire, and emergency medical service communities, partners in the private sector, and the public with a greater level of awareness and capability. These are the people who are going to be able to first recognize when something is out of place and prevent the next attack. So one of the things that we've seen a significant uptick in is extremist literature. Extremist literature not only provides the know-how, but also calls untold numbers of disaffected individuals, including within our own borders, to action. As demonstrated in the Boston Marathon bombing attack, domestic terrorists are reading these magazines. Back in 2015, here in South Dakota, we had a violent extremist. He was an environmental violent extremist who was actually building bombs at a campground here in South Dakota. And his goal, his stated goal, was to turn off the lights. But he was using a foreign terrorist organization's propaganda magazine that actually had an article in it called How to Build a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. So even out here in Region 8, we see this type of terrorist literature and extremist literature make its way over here, and non-foreign terrorist organizations using it in order to build bombs and things like that. Next slide, please, Tim. Bombs are often used not only by religiously radical terrorists, but also by everyday criminals and political extremists with the intention of inflicting mass casualties. In the case of bomb threats, the intention is to cause fear and disruption of operations. So obviously the difference between the actual bomb going off and the damage caused by that, what we're talking about tonight is specifically bomb threats and the disruption that those may cause to your facility, the fear they may cause, the panic they may cause. Commercial and religious facilities have long been attractive targets for criminals and terrorists, domestically and abroad, on account of being easily accessible and heavily populated. IEDs can appear as almost anything, as we mentioned previously. Go to the next slide, Tim. The devastating impacts of an actual bombing incident are important to be aware of, but equally important, given the likelihood of each scenario, is understanding the impact that bomb threats alone can have on a facility, an organization, and the personnel within. So how often are bomb threats made? Why are they making them? How are they making them? What are the targets, and what's the impact to my facility, my community? So in general, in any given year, there's approximately about 1,800 bomb threats reported in the United States, and 3 of those involved actual explosives. And in all 3 of those threats were actually made in person, not in any of the other ways that we talk about there on the left side of your screen. They were actually made in person. 38 out of those 1,800 involved a hoax device, which we define as a device reported to be an explosive which contains no explosive properties. So that might be a box with wires sticking out of it. I've seen bricks that have wires taped to them so it looks like a block of C4. So lots of different things that may be a hoax. So depending on the perpetrator, the intent behind any bomb threat may differ. Most commonly used to disrupt or harass, and they're less commonly used to extort people for money. Second. So bomb threats are frequently delivered, as we talk on here, by telephone. That's over almost 60% were delivered by telephone. Written, close to 25%. Text message, very, very low percent. Email and social media, still very low percent. And then in person, like I said, a very low percentage are actually made in person. And of those, 3 approximately are actual devices, and the majority of those are hoaxes. So common targets, schools, right? I mean, we see a lot of bomb threats in schools, oddly enough, usually during finals weeks, either at the semester or at the end of the year. We see quite a few bomb threats to shut down schools. We see them at religious facilities. We see them at commercial businesses, courthouses. And in all of these places, the bomb threats are used to disrupt the actual operation of that facility. So what kind of impacts? So bomb threats incur severe impacts on facilities and personnel regardless of the perpetrator's intent. Across the board, the perpetrator generally wants to create an atmosphere of anxiety and panic, which will, in turn, result in the disruption of normal activities at the facility where the device is purportedly located. Panic is caused by fear of the known or the unknown and is one of the most contagious of all human emotions. Panic can be considered the ultimate achievement of bomb threat caller. Once a state of panic has been reached, the potential for personal injury and property damage is dramatically increased. Go to the next slide, Tim. So here we're going to talk a little bit, we'll have a video here in a second, but what we're going to talk a little bit about is a case study at the University of Pittsburgh, which shows that, as you can see on there on the slide, there was over 160 email and telephone threats called in, and the reason behind it was actually we still don't know. They've never made an arrest in this case. They believe, as it says on there, that they know who it was, but they've actually never made an arrest in it. And some of their claims and things like that were interesting. So Tim, if you want to go ahead and show the video, and then we're going to talk about it.
New information on dozens of bomb threats at the University of Pittsburgh. These threats began 2 months ago, leaving students and the faculty on edge. And by mid-afternoon yesterday, there were 4 more threats. Meanwhile, security is taking extraordinary measures to lock down the campus. Ken Trump is president of National School Safety and Security Services. Bill Daley is a former FBI investigator and senior vice president of Control Risk Security Consulting. Good to see you both. Bill, you know, the bomb threats began in February, but they've been escalating. It's no longer just one building. We're talking about multiple targets on campus. So far, about 25 threats. What do you make of this? All of the automatic evacuations that have been taking place may be the wrong approach?
The best practice, contrary to what's sort of intuitive to the layperson, is to evaluate the threat on a case-by-case basis by school and law enforcement to avoid automatic evacuations. And one of the bigger concerns, unless there's an obvious device or immediate imminent threat, but the biggest concern is when you have professors individually choosing to go outside of the security procedures and take someone outside to hold classes. That could expose them to greater outside visibility and a potential target for a shooting or other type of violent attack outside than if they stayed inside and worked with their security officials. So the person who's going off on their own may have good intentions, but security that's heightened is going to mean heightened inconvenience as well.
Wow, sad situation. Ken Trump, Bill Daley. Gentlemen, thank you both.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Tim. So what happened was from February 13th of 2012 to April 21st of 2012, the University of Pittsburgh received over 160 bomb threats. So in just that 2-month time frame, they've received 160 bomb threats targeting 52 buildings on their campus, leading to over 136 evacuations. Threats were received through numerous means, including email, handwritten on walls, and phone calls, and as many as 5 or more threats per day occurred at some points during that time. So you can imagine the panic, the chaos, the disruption that caused the University of Pittsburgh. So some of the impacts that came from that, or some of the outcomes that came from that. So severe disruption of operations across the university and broader community. The FBI and Secret Service have identified at least one person of interest related to the case, and local police have also been collaborating or were collaborating with the Department of Justice and the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So you can only imagine the type of chaos that would cause by 2 months. That's 160, up to 5 a day, depending on the day of the week. So next slide, please. So specifically some threats to a case study about threats to the Jewish community. So in January and February of 2017, the suspect in this case, or the defendant in this case, Thompson, appears to have made at least 8 Jewish community center threats as part of his campaign of harassments against an ex-girlfriend. For instance, on or about February 21st of 2017, the Anti-Defamation League received an email threat at their Midtown Manhattan office, which indicated that the ex-girlfriend's name and her birth date is behind the bomb threats against Jews. She lives in New York City and is making more bomb threats tomorrow. The next day, the Anti-Defamation League received a phone call claiming that explosive material had been placed in their Midtown Manhattan office. Some of Thompson's JCC threats appear to have been made in his own name as part of an effort to claim that the victim was trying to frame Thompson for the crime. For instance, on or about February 7, 2017, a JCC in Manhattan received an email bomb threat from an anonymous email account which stated, Juan Thompson, along with his birthday, put 2 bombs in the office of the Jewish Center today. He wants to create Jewish Newtown tomorrow. The email's use of the phrase Jewish Newtown appeared to refer to the December 2012 school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, in which a gunman murdered 26 victims. So a little bit more about the case, as an arrest was made in connection to the 8 of the bomb threats calls. The federal authorities have charged a St. Louis man with making more than 6 bomb threats against Jewish community centers, schools, and a Jewish history museum, an unsealed court document said. The man, Juan Thompson, was later convicted for those crimes. So once again, you know, his goal is not to disrupt anything, but actually to get back at his ex-girlfriend for what he perceived as a wrong. Next slide, please. We'll go through this one pretty quickly. The Manchester case study. This was an actual where they actually the perpetrator behind this parked a vehicle-borne and improvised explosive device in Manchester, England, and actually called local law enforcement and let them know that it was there. His goal was a political statement and terrorism, but not to hurt anybody. So this was a bomb threat that actually had a real live device associated with it. But once again, he was trying to make a political statement, which then the IRA during the 80s and 90s or 70s and 80s were well known for using bomb threats with real devices in order to get people to leave but make a political statement. They didn't actually want to hurt anybody. So we can go on to the next slide, Tim. So what are the goals of bomb threat management? So some of those goals are to minimize consequences of a potential attack or threat on personnel instructions, help develop an evacuation plan, and design preparedness training to reduce panic during a threat. We want you to be able to make informed decisions during bomb threat analysis, which we'll cover later, and then assess the risk posed by an individual bomb threat and selecting the appropriate course of action based on your determination. We want to deter potential perpetrators, that was hard for me to say tonight, of bombing incidents. The use of protective measures to deter potential bombers from selecting your facility to conduct a threat or an actual attack. And then lastly, mitigate vulnerabilities to bombing incidents. Next slide, please, Tom. So as Jory talked about earlier, the planning process is the same. We're going to go through it looking specifically at bomb threat management, not just, from security planning in general. So as Jory talked about, we want to, build a planning team. So the planning team is normally designated by the facility management and should be composed of personnel who specialize in security and emergency planning. Local responders and or emergency management personnel should be included on the team, as they may interact with response to teams in case of an incident. In case of an incident, excuse me. So we want you, as Jory talked about, to understand the situation. Without understanding the potential situation or potential problems of your environment, you cannot develop a relevant plan. Understanding the situation is an ongoing process. Without it, planning is incomplete. The majority of information related to the environment and the potential problems will be gathered through the vulnerability assessment or the risk management process. Once information on your situation is gathered, you must analyze how it affects the plan you're developing. Additionally, always be aware of current threats related to your geographic region or impacting your business sector. As we talked about earlier, we've seen a rise in bomb threats specific to houses of worship. So that would be what we talk about your business sector. We want you to determine your goals and objectives. As part of an organization's risk management process, a facility's decision maker needs to determine priorities for securing a facility and mitigating risk from explosive devices. Then use these priorities to establish goals and objectives. Your goals and objectives. Priorities must be established before developing goals and objectives, and goals and objectives are developed based on the information gathered regarding the potential problems that may be encountered in your environment. And then start developing your plan. So when developing a comprehensive security plan specific to the facility or event, it should address as appropriate topics such as the protection of the people in your house of worship, right? The employees, the people that come worship every week. Then you want to consider facility access. How are we letting people into our facility? Do we just have one door that they come in? Do we have multiple doors that they come in? We want to talk about suspicious activity reporting procedures. We want to talk about where the parking is, mail security. Do we even allow mail to come to our facility? Prohibited items we're not going to allow in our facility. Do we have a security force? End of day security checks if we need to do those. Electronic security systems, including your surveillance cameras. Physical security that we talked about. Special event, if you're going to open it up to other things besides just having it as a house of worship. And then also, as Jory talked about earlier, what kind of awareness training programs are we having for our folks? So the draft plan should be reviewed for discrepancies and presented to your leadership for approval. Once approved, the plan should be circulated to the entire response team in your facility, or to the ushers, the greeters that Jory talked about, and all personnel should be educated on the role if an incident should occur. The key to remember about bomb threat planning is that the process is continual and involving. So once your plan has been written, reviewed, and exercised, it is essential that the planning team continue ongoing evaluations. This process is critical to identifying and addressing any discrepancies in the plan following after-action reviews of the executed plan or environmental changes. It is important that the revisions are circulated to all team members and personnel affected by the revisions. Having a viable and exercised bomb threat management plan will help reduce the risk associated with threats the plan is developed to address. Next slide, please. So what are the elements of a plan? So we've talked about, what kind of team to put together and what the 6-step planning process is, but what actually should be in part of your plan. So bomb threat plans will vary in length and detail depending on the nature and size of the facility and the risk itself. But there are core elements that should be included in every bomb threat plan. Some of these are designation of your team member responsibilities. There are several team members of the bomb threat management team whose roles and responsibility must be identified in the bomb threat management plan. Some of these members are the receiving party, right? So who is getting that call? And everybody needs to be trained on that role, because who knows who might be answering the phone or getting the email or checking the voicemail, whatever it might be. The decision maker, who's actually going to be in charge during that time frame to make the decision on whether we're going to evacuate, whether we're doing a partial evacuation, a full evacuation, or not evacuating, or when we're going to call law enforcement, those types of things. So search team leader, who's going to be on the search team, evacuation team leader, and those types of roles. Next thing we're going to talk about is most bomb threats are answered by a recipient on the phone with a publicly listed number. Other methods of receiving a threat include written notes, email, social media, as we talked about previously. So, and part of your plan also is a procedure for evaluating the threat level. The person who received the call, verbal threat note, however it may come in, is the one that briefs the decision maker. That person should be allowed to fully describe any conversation that occurred in their own words before asking them questions. This ensures the recipient is speaking directly from memory without the influence of outside suggestion. The decision maker will consider the description provided by the person receiving the threat when evaluating the threat. The decision maker will evaluate the threat by determining if it's low risk, medium risk, or high risk. We will actually talk about each one of those levels here later in the brief. Determining the authenticity of a bomb threat is very difficult. Consideration must be given to the exact wording of the threat, prior acts. What we talked about with the University of Pittsburgh, they got 160 in 2 months. So at some point, you've got to start understanding what the actual risk of those is. Current events regarding this or similar facilities, individuals or actions at the site, accessibility of the site, occupants of the site, and so on. So something else to consider is a designated location of a command post where you're going to move off site to, so that the decision maker can make a decision and allow law enforcement in, those types of things. And then what is your search and evacuation plan? How are we going to search our facility? Next slide, please. So responding to bomb threats. How are we going to effectively respond to bomb threats? So if they're on telephone, we're going to collect as much information about the threat and caller as you can. Don't hang up your phone, even if it's a cell phone. There's certain data that law enforcement can use as long as you haven't hung up. Even if they hung up on you, there's still a reason not to hit the hang up button, is how we've been briefed. Use a separate phone to call the police, and avoid cell phones. The reason to avoid cell phones is a lot of IEDs are radio controlled, or that's what they're called, is radio controlled IEDs, and the cell phone may actually activate the IED. So move to a landline, move a long ways away, whatever you need to do. Written, avoid touching the note and leave the note where you found it. Internet, once again, don't turn it off or log out of your email or social media account, and use a landline to contact police. In person, be aware of your psychological distress state or their psychological distress state. Maintain distance from the individual, contact police immediately, and ensure your physical safety before attempting to detain the individual. And I highly recommend not detaining the individual, but calling law enforcement, being a good witness. You can go to the next slide. So the next slide is actually a video, and it will walk through all those steps I just talked about. CISA and our Office for Bombing Prevention put this together a couple of years ago, and it's a very good email, or very good video, excuse me. Go ahead, Tim.
Let me get you up to speed. My name is Veronica Simon. I'm an office administrator at my place of work, and today is like any other Tuesday. Good afternoon, this is Veronica. How may I help you?
There's going to be a bomb today.
In a bomb threat call, the best thing you can do is to remain calm and keep the caller on the line for as long as possible. Your goal here is to obtain as much information as possible from the caller so you can relay this information to the authorities. If you have a moment, write a note to someone nearby. I'll get one of my co-workers' attention, and they can contact the authorities to inform them that a bomb threat call is in progress. I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
There's going to be a bomb today. People are going to die.
Now that I've alerted my co-workers about the threat, they can activate our bomb threat management plan and call 911 from a safe location. If your employer doesn't have a plan yet, you can go to www.cisa.gov/OBP for more information and to find this checklist. Next, I'm going to ask the caller a series of questions from this checklist, remembering to be as polite as possible and demonstrating the same amount of respect I would normally provide anyone else. Sir, when is the bomb going to explode?
In 1 hour, if all operations at your institution have not ceased.
Don't forget to listen for background noise. Hear those cars passing by in the background of the call? Make a mental note of anything you hear so you can mark it down later after the call. Next, I'm going to ask the caller where the bomb is located. In doing so, as with all these questions, I'm going to avoid prompting the caller with names or locations of the facilities, which will provide more clues about the identity of the caller and the validity of the threat. If he provides a specific place or building, he may be familiar with the location and vice versa. Okay, and where is the bomb located?
Inside the main lobby.
Did you hear the caller clear his throat there? Make another mental note of any irregularities in the caller's voice or speech patterns so we can mark that down later as well. Okay, sir, and what does the bomb look like?
It's inside of a black duffel bag.
Black duffel bag. All right. And what will cause the bomb to explode?
I will detonate the bomb in 1 hour if my demands have not been met.
Sir, did you place this... Hello, sir? After the caller hangs up, it's important that I don't hang up my phone. Instead, I'll place it on my desk, jot down in as much detail as possible information from the call. Towards the bottom of the card, there's a checklist for details about the caller's voice, any background noise, and the threat language. Here's where those mental notes from earlier really come into play. Information like this can be crucial in identifying the caller and legitimacy of the threat. Last but not least, I'm going to note the number the call was received from, as shown on my caller ID. After I'm done making notes, it's time to share my information with my leadership and local authorities. I'm going to avoid touching any switches or buttons of any kind. I'm going to avoid using my cell phone unless I have no other choice, in case it might detonate the bomb.
So you took the call. Tell us what you know.
The caller had a deep voice.
So how do we actually assess a bomb threat? So that decision maker, how do we actually assess that bomb threat? So there's what we consider three levels. So there's low risk, medium risk, and high risk. And I will be honest with you, it's the medium risk ones that probably cause the most concern. You know, if it's high risk and we believe it's high risk, we're going to evacuate the building, or we're going to shelter in place and get law enforcement there, whatever we need to do based on what that risk is. Low risk, it's obviously, as it says in the slide, it lacks realism. We know it's probably not a real threat and we need to do a few things, but we don't need to probably evacuate the facility. Medium risk is where there's a significant judgment call, and that puts the onus obviously back on the decision maker. So some of the things that we talk about when we talk about low risk is a threat poses a minimum risk to the victim or the public safety. Probable motive is disruption. So you look at high schools or college campuses, if they're getting those bomb threats during finals week, you know, there's probably a lack of realism. Or the probable motivation is disruption. Threat is vague and indirect. Information is inconsistent, implausible, or lacks detail. So what we're talking about here is we had recently, a few years ago, we had lots and lots of different college universities across the nation receive a very large amount of bomb threats. And so one here in South Dakota received a bomb threat. You know, it's in certain hall, which they didn't even have a hall with that name. And that it was in room 212. So not only did they not have that hall, they didn't have a room 212 anywhere on campus. And so, you know, you can start to assume that that's probably, they've never been to that campus. It's probably not real. So, you know, if you're relating that to a house of worship, if you don't have some type of, you know, anteroom, you know, on your facility, and they say they placed the bomb in the anteroom, it's probably not a real bomb threat. They obviously have never been to your facility. Threat was indirectly delivered, written on the wall or in an email, and caller makes frequent contact or is known to your facility. We're going to talk a little bit about the high risk ones, and then we'll come back to the medium risk ones. So the high risk, the other end of that, is the threat poses an immediate and serious danger to the public safety. The threat is direct, specific, and realistic, may include names, time, and or location of the device. So, hey, I put it in Bob's office. You know, it's underneath Susan's desk. And you have a Bob or a Susan there. It's very, very real. Perpetrator provides his or her identity, and threat suggests the concrete steps have been taken by the perpetrator to actually do it. Hey, I came in the building this morning before it opened and placed it, you know, underneath Bob's desk. And the perpetrator indicates practice with a weapon or surveillance of intended victim. They know where it's going to be at and what they're going to be doing. So like I said earlier, the medium risk is probably the hardest for us to identify. And so the threat may be carried out, but may not appear entirely realistic. The threat is direct and feasible, but the wording suggests thoughtful planning. That's how the act will be carried out. There is an indication of place and time, but it's not specific. And the threat includes possible references that to the facility, and the perpetrator is obviously familiar with bomb components, and there is an increased specificity of the threat. Those are the ones that, you know, like it could be real, but it may not be real. And so those are the ones that actually take, you know, some serious thought, you know, in planning, so that you know what you're going to do based on those. You can go to the next slide, please, Tim. So what are some of the courses of action we can take based on those different levels of threat? So examples of those, so for minimal threat or low threat, low risk, so you can assess the threat and discount it based on experience. You can assess the threat, determine that the threat of an existing device is low, and locking down the facility to ensure no other suspicious items may enter your facility. For those in the medium threat area, you know, you assess your threat, determine realistic potential of a suspicious device, and lock down the facility and conduct a full or a partial search for the device. And then under high threat, one of the responses is assess the threat is specific and realistic, and conduct a partial or full evacuation of your facility. As it says at the bottom, that site decision maker or appropriate on-site supervisor ultimately determines what action to take regardless of the assessment that is made. Automatic evacuation, as we talked about earlier, just from the disruption part, may not be the best course of action either. Depending on where the caller or the bomb threat says that they've placed the device, maybe it's in your egress route and you can't just leave the facility. It's by the front door and we don't have a back door, or the back door is very difficult to get to, or we can't move everybody out that back door because, there's a large flight of stairs. 10 to 15% of the United States population is disabled. We have a large elderly population at our facility, at our church. And so we may not be able to move all those people out, as effectively as we can. And so maybe locking down and searching, while it's going on, is the appropriate course of action. So some of the things to consider when searching, is, factors determine if the search is conducted before or after the evacuation. What are your search priorities? And then what are some steps we can take to ensure the safety of our people? Minimize the use of wireless communication, such as cell phones or radios. Limit search to 15 minutes before you take a break. You start to see things that aren't there, or maybe you are missing things, so to take a break after 15 minutes. Minimize the number of people participating in zone searches, and ensure all areas are searched and clearly marked or recorded. Steps for the search team to follow to ensure their personal safety: never touch, move, or cover a suspicious object. Never spend more time near a suspicious object than necessary. Isolate the object, and move non-search personnel away to a safe distance to prevent others from approaching. You can go next slide, Tim. So we talked a little bit just a minute ago about suspicious items. So what is a suspicious item versus an unattended item? So we use the acronym HOT, or the mnemonic HOT, to identify what is suspicious versus what is intended. So the H is for intentionally hidden, the O is for the item is obviously suspicious, and the T is for the item is not typically in that environment. This will help you to, and building personnel to distinguish between suspicious and unattended. Suspicious items are anything that are believed to contain an explosive or an IED. They include some of those indicators may be that there's suspicious placement or proximity to people or valuable assets related to a specific threat. If you get a bomb threat, called in bomb threat, and they say it's a black bag by the front door, and you look up and there's a black bag by the front door, you can consider that a suspicious item. Require a bomb technician for further evaluation. And they have unexplainable wires or electronics, other visible bomb-like components, and unusual sounds, vapor, mists, or odors. What is an unintended thing? So it could be anything, right? A bag, a package, a vehicle, but they're not in someone's possessions. They have no obvious signs of being suspicious, and they do not relate or correlate to any received threat. So what do you do after determining an item is suspicious? Next slide, Tim. So if we use it, once again, we're the federal government, so we use lots and lots of acronyms and mnemonics. And so when you're addressing a suspicious item, we use RAIN. So R, recognize the indicators of a suspected explosive device. Remember that suspicious devices are hot. That's hidden, hidden, obviously suspicious, and not typical for the environment. Avoid the device item. Do not touch the device. Move away from the suspected device immediately. So A for avoid. I, isolate. Secure the perimeter of the area surrounding the device. If possible, one should wear protective equipment or use frontal and overhead cover in case of detonation. And N, notify the appropriate emergency services. And then at the bottom we have the, if you see something, say something. Next, we will cover some technical and procedural protective measures that a facility can implement in order to protect and prevent against consequences of bombs and bomb threats. So Jory did a very good job of covering protective measures around the security of a facility. It's very much the same for what we're talking about for bomb threat management. So I'm not going to go real in depth for this, but there's obviously, physical and design things you can do to force people to come all through the front door, using fence, using vegetation, using trees, whatever it might be, social engineer so that everybody comes through the front door so that your greeters or ushers can get eyes on everybody and look for those nervous people that might, be a threat to your facility. And then we obviously have the technical and procedural, which would include, our surveillance cameras, our bomb threat plans, security forces, if you decide you want to do that, and those types of things. Next slide, Tim. So in summary, we talked about what an IED is. We talked about what are the actual potential consequences of the bomb threat, that panic, that disruption. We talked a lot about the components of a bomb threat management plan. And then we described the procedures for evaluating the threat, including, using the risk assessment methodology that we talked about, low, medium, and high, and what goes into those, along with how to assess a suspicious device using hot and then rain. And then we listed some appropriate protective measures that Dory did a good job in the last session talking about. Next slide, please. So here are a few bomb threat resources. At the beginning of the chat, I placed all of these along with another resource in there, but there's also obviously the website at the bottom, CISA.gov, what to do bomb threat, but all these are in the chat and you're free to download those and use those as you see fit. Next slide, please. So a few classes, we have a plethora of classes designed, they're virtual instructor-led and online courses so that you can go through and learn more about bomb threat preparedness, how to respond to suspicious behaviors, more in depth about bomb threat management planning than what we just did tonight, and then search procedures, etc. I mean, there's a whole myriad out there, and they can be found at that CISA.gov bombing prevention training at the bottom. Next slide, please. Any questions? I know there was a few in the chat, Tim, if you don't mind going through them.
Yeah. So we had a few questions and comments pop up in the chat during your presentations. One was how frequently should voicemails be checked regarding bomb threats? I don't know if someone can answer a recommendation for that or just as able to monitor that as soon as possible. Does anyone have a recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, so if your facility's not staffed all the time and there's not somebody there to answer the phone or check voicemails when they come in, I would say at least once a day looking for that stuff, I think would be an appropriate course of action to take.
Thank you. And then the question about different communities and if we have statistics comparing the different communities, volume, frequency, actual numbers. I don't recall any statistics that we have in these presentations, Scott.
I don't have them right at my fingertips. I'm sure that's something that we could track down if you'd like them.
Yeah. Hey, this is Sean. Yeah, I don't know that we have the breakdown per, faith organization. I don't know that, that we could provide that. What I would say is that we've seen a general uptick across the board in sort of threat information and threats to faith-based organizations. And so that's why we're kind of here today and talking sort of faith agnostically about just across the board what we can be doing as a community to increase our security and resilience.
Thank you. And another question was regarding only having one landline. What can they do?
Sure. So, I mean, lots of different options out there. Obviously, try to get away from the area and call by cell phone if you need to. Another good option is a lot of public safety answering points now allow you to text to them. And so that would be another option, or texting somebody else and asking them to call 911 for you.
Thank you. Any questions? Anyone would like to come off mute and ask a question or enter it in chat? I don't see any more and no one actively typing. We'll give it a moment, Scott.
But if about texting, that's still using my cell phone.
I agree. I'm sorry. There's an echo. So you're right. It is still using your cell phone. However, what we've seen, from radio controlled or remote controlled IEDs, the text message is a much smaller packet and will generally not activate something versus actually calling on a landline or calling on, excuse me, from a cell phone. That's much longer.
Great, thank you.
Hey, any other questions before Scott wraps up his presentation? This will be shared in the deck in the package that's emailed out, so you can review it later. And a reminder that the presentations are all being recorded and the video will be shared via link once available. Thank you, Scott.
Once again, thank you all for having us. I appreciate it.
Next, I'll introduce Mickey Munson, our cybersecurity advisor from Wyoming, as part of our Region 8 CISA cybersecurity advisor team. Welcome, Mickey, and I will bring up your slides momentarily.
Awesome, thank you. I'll do my quick introduction before we get started. So like Tim said, I am Mickey Munson. I am the cybersecurity advisor here in Wyoming in Region 8. And so you guys have the pleasure of listening to me and a little bit of cybersecurity here at the end of the evening. But again, feel free to post your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you have any questions. We will be going through quite a bit of information rather quickly. Some of it is geared towards your IT departments. If you don't have one, what things you can do still to secure yourself on the internet. And like Scott, I will turn my camera off just to save the bandwidth as well. All right, next slide, Tim. All right, so cybersecurity advisor program, what is it, right? So our role is, as a cybersecurity advisor or CSA, is to provide direct coordination, outreach, and regional support to our critical infrastructure partners, our state and local territory, communities, cities, counties, those types of things, in order to protect our critical infrastructure from any cyber threats. Our emphasis is really on prevention, and we still do assist, but we really do focus on prevention. This could mean assisting any organization to help better understand their cybersecurity posture or help them improve. The smaller organizations all the way to working with Fortune 500 companies to make sure that they're more resilient and again that we can support our critical infrastructure. Next slide. So some of the offerings that we provide at no cost are preparedness activities and our response activities. So our preparedness activities, we do cyber assessments that can take anywhere from 3 to 4 hours all the way up to 6 hours. And these are some pretty in-depth assessments that can be useful to really get a baseline on your network, baseline on what your guys' cyber posture looks like, what your cyber hygiene is, to just really having a conversation and helping you start an incident management plan. It's another important piece of the puzzle, just like the bombing prevention, just like the physical security side of it, the cyber side is just as important. One can always cause another. And then really looking at any exercise playbooks, we can help coordinate, design, run, facilitate any type of cyber exercise. And then we can also provide cybersecurity advisories and alerts, connect you with our fusion centers that are throughout the state. Jory mentioned those earlier, to make sure that you're getting those up-to-date alerts as well. And then for the more IT side of the house, any known exploited vulnerabilities or a KEV catalog. On our CISA website, we have a really, really extensive list of all known vulnerabilities that are out there right now. To our cyber performance goals, and then we have a bunch of free cybersecurity tools and services on our website as well. And then the response assistance is that threat intelligence reporting and information sharing, malware analysis. Some states do have, like in Wyoming, we have a cyber response team that we're a part of. So we sit and help advise that team. So that's another aspect of being on that response side. Next slide, please. One of our most popular and probably most used tool is our vulnerability scanning. And so this is something that you can sign up for free. All of our offerings are free. And this will, once you sign up, you provide some IP addresses, some different information, fill out a couple documents, and they will start to scan your network for any vulnerabilities, your open ports towards the internet. And so we kind of pulled some numbers today, about 150 plus counties or entities, businesses in Colorado, 70 plus in South Dakota, 30 plus in Wyoming, and about 4,200 or so in Utah that are currently utilizing this. So there's thousands of organizations nationwide that are using this service that we're offering. You can go to that web link down below, the vulnerability at cisa.dhs.gov, to sign up. And they are super helpful to help walk you through that process on how to get started with them. Next slide, please. So some common misconceptions about cyber security. I'm not important. We're not big enough. We're a small congregation. We're a small church. We're a small community. If you're on the internet, connected to the internet, you are a target. My devices are secure enough. They're right out of the box. This is actually something we dealt with in my home the other day. The the internet service provider showed up at my house. We had to do some updates, and they brought a new router. And they're like, hey, do you want us to change the name and the password to your router? Yes, please. Let's just not keep it what it is right out of the box. Let's secure it and make sure that we're making it secure and harder for cyber criminals to get to. So just because you pull it right out of the box doesn't mean it's always secure. Cybersecurity problems are somebody else's problems. Another misconception that it's everybody's, a lot of people do banking online. If you guys do any of your tithing online, any online donations, congregation lists, anything like that, that's all connected to the internet and it's open and someone can get it if they want it. And then the human factor is the number one vulnerability. There's always that sense of urgency in an email. Our contracts have changed. Please click this link. Send us your updated information. The cyber criminals are always trying to make that sense of urgency, and people fall for it. I think in some way, shape, or form, everybody's always been a victim of that. And so just knowing those tactics on how they are approaching people to get them to click the link to get their data. Next slide, please. So the internet, there's the internet, right? And then there's the World Wide Web. The tip of the iceberg is typically what everybody thinks it is, but that's really about 5 to 10% of the internet as we know it. This includes web pages we visit, social media, Facebook, Google, news sites, Twitters, cat videos. Everybody loves cat videos, or raccoon videos. That's what my daughter loves. All the day-to-day stuff we use. That's about that top part, that 5% of the internet. Then there's the deep web and all those places that are not indexed by Google, Yahoo, Bing, whatever your search engine is. It may be accessed if you know the IP address, the URL. You might need a password or other credentials to access it. Think of access to your online banking accounts, web email, databases, something that's more secure that you need a username and login to get to, maybe multi-factor authentication, like if you're logging into your medical, if you have the medical apps, like my doctor's office has an online app where you can check in, something like that that's secure. And then all of those other databases that exist that are connected to the internet, those make up the deep web, the 90%. And then there's the dark web. And that's the part of the internet where you need specific software to access. Tor or an Onion router is an example on how to get it. You need specific software to get there. These are private computer networks that use a technology to allow users to surf anonymously on the network. That's where a lot of our ransomware criminals, they like to sell your information, buying and selling and trading in the dark web of illegal things. It's kind of filled with stores like Amazon, eBay, Craigslist, stuff like that. They have their own version of those in the dark web. And I remember the first time I actually got to see what it looks like when I was doing some stuff for the state, I was a little disappointed because it kind of looked like Google. I was thinking, it was all going to be dark and mysterious, but it's not. But it's a very bad place where a lot of things happen. And one of our fire boards recently just got hit with check fraud. And our treasurer made the comment to me. He's like, I didn't know the dark web was a thing. Did you guys know that was a thing? I thought it was something people just put on TV to make it scary. I looked at him. I was like, you and I have had you know what my job is, right? Yes, it's a real thing. And so we had a more in-depth conversation about the dark web and about these things, but it is very real. It isn't just something that they use as a scare tactic on TV. There's a lot of bad things that happen on there. And again, all your information, if it's been stolen, is being bought and sold there. Next slide, please. Also, going back to the web again, this is what happens every minute of the day. So people searching on Yelp reviews, text messages sent, emails being sent, people shopping online. Christmas time is coming, the holidays are coming. So people are on the internet all the time. On Pinterest, my mom has me get on Pinterest for her all the time because we're building a house for her. So she wants me to Pinterest stuff. YouTube. This is what's happening every minute of the day. And this is all opportunities for you to be vulnerable and exposed to the internet and to cyber criminals. Next slide, please. So what is the cyber risk? So the cyber risk is really that likelihood of any specific threat that can exploit you to any specific vulnerabilities. So think where the threat equals we're in the intent, the capability, and the opportunity. Cyber criminals are always looking for that opportunity to take your information, expose you, and take advantage of those vulnerabilities. So people, programs, hardwares, systems, the internet, those are all threats. Then the vulnerabilities is the weakness in your IT system or your operational technology system. So for water, wastewater, think of something with a SCADA system, a system that operates their facility. And then what are those consequences? They're the effects of the incident. So an example I always like to use is if somebody walks by and jiggles your door handle on your front door every day at 5 o'clock, they're trying to find a way in. When you would report that. So same thing on the cyber side. If your IT department is seeing suspicious links always being sent, or the same email over and over, or you as like the receptionist, you see the same email with the same urgency, they're jiggling the door handle, they're trying to see if they can get into your network, if somebody is going to click on the link. So that's where that cyber risk, that threat, that vulnerability comes into play. Next slide, please. And so the threat is real. So I have a couple of these starred. 95% of data breaches are result in human error. So like I just said, clicking on that link. A big one that was going around a couple of years ago was on Facebook, was through Messenger. Hey, is this you on the internet? And people would click the link and then it would send a Facebook message to everybody in your friends list. Clicking the link, seeing, is this really me? The urgency. We had a couple of them when I worked for the state where our director was out traveling and we all got emails that she needed us to send her some Amazon gift cards so she can give them out at this conference. There's also, hey, we're changing our contracts and we need you to verify your account information. Please fill out this form. That sense of urgency that's going to catch that human error. So just really paying attention to, is that really their email address? Like hovering over it, looking at it. Is that really that, there's misspellings in the email, those types of things. And then around 94% of all, or email is responsible for 94% of all malware. A lot of small organizations and even large organizations, their internet or email provider will have some sort of phishing or spam folder that you can set up. So that stuff can get filtered out, or you can report it as spam. Even cell phones nowadays will come in with that spam where it says, hey, these text messages have been moved to spam, because they're starting to help with that human error and help do some of that for you. And then again, globally, 30,000 websites a day are hacked. And some of those could just be website defacement. So the criminals can prove that they can do something, or they're truly stealing your data and then selling it back on the dark web, or selling how they got into your system so somebody else can take advantage of it. Next slide, please. And then the consequences. So threat actors, they'll engage in targeted campaigns, as well as they will discriminate, or excuse me, do vulnerability scannings for victims for opportunities of compromise. So 23andMe, they were recently a victim of this. The hackers claim their stolen genetic data, or have to stolen their genetic data, and attempting to sell that information. They're selling profiles, emails, photos, gender, date of birth, and DNA ancestry. And some of that the form that they're selling it on is referring to Central and Eastern European and Jewish heritage. So some of it could be targeted, some of it could just be they're stealing all of that data. Just like the OPM breach as well, that has happened. I think they've been breached twice. That data has been stolen and sold. So for businesses, some of that consequences is how do you make your customers whole again? So if it's your congregation list that's stolen, if it's your guys' email listserv, something like that, how are you going to share that information and help make those your members whole again? And then also some other campaigns that have happened over the last several years. There's a lot of them, but North Korea was linked to a hacking campaign, and you'll see an increase of these types of campaigns during like elections. You know, any type of, you can kind of see it ebb and flow through what is going on in the world today. You'll see increase of what is called a DDoS attack, where they try to take down overload your system with a lot of emails at once. You know, and like what Scott was talking about with a lot of the bomb threats that will come in, you'll see a lot of those happen over and over again to a same system to try to take down the system. Next slide, please. And then some more consequences. So the primary effects are very direct. They can affect your IT service to take down your whole phone system, email system, banking system, anything that you use your entire network. Secondary effects, you know, they impact, what are those other ones? So we've had instances where, you know, it might be a utility that gets hit and they can't do banking. So they can't run bills, process any payments, pull any of the wattage for their payment system. Time, it takes a lot of time due to a cyber attack. We've had some facilities, you know, as a community college, where if the ransomware attack would have gone a week longer, they would have had to shut their doors permanently. So it takes time to recover, especially if there's not good backups of their data and their information. And then the cost, millions of dollars is associated with a cyber attack or ransomware attack to recover on, you know, not just lost wages, but data, computer systems, resources, and people to help. And then again, the indirect impacts or disruption. What service is it delaying you or preventing you to provide to the community? So if it's, you know, if you as a congregation or your house of worship gets hit, you may not be able to provide a service to them because your facility is taken down. You can't answer the phone. You can't send an email. You can't do some of the things that you need to do because of that attack. Next slide, please. And then just some more non-monetary costs, credibility, disruption in operations or ongoing performance, relationships, or revenue lost, increased insurance premiums. A lot of people nowadays have cyber insurance. And so if, just like any other insurance, if a lot of check marks or check the boxes haven't been done, your cyber insurance may not cover you. Some instances, it could be a drop in credit rating, contracts terminated, intellectual property could be stolen. This is a lot on more of either universities or some of those other bigger facilities, and reputation. And then kind of back to that credibility, you know, we've had some places where, like with that 23andMe, I've done a 23andMe several years ago, and I got one of the emails that, hey, your stuff might have been compromised. And I kind of giggled to myself. I said, well, it already was in the OPM breach, so we'll just add this to another one. But their email to me is how they were going to make me whole. How are they rebuilding their credibility? What are they letting me know to make this better? Next slide, please. And again, some other things to think about is contract details, any your emails through data breaches, amount of money that being donated, is that potentially at risk if you have that on your computer system, if it's out in the cloud, if it's where it's stored, your congregation list. Like I mentioned earlier, people do donations like our church, they don't pass the basket anymore. It's all done online. So it's another vulnerability opportunity for the bad guy to take advantage of and have an opportunity to take my information along with other people's information as well. Next slide. And so bringing back to kind of what Jory and Scott has talked about earlier tonight is mitigating those attacks, establishing a multi-layer plan for security, identifying clear roles. If you don't have someone who helps manage your network or in the IT department, maybe you guys sit down and see if you have somebody in your congregation that has that experience or that knowledge that can help fill that role. Creating your emergency action plans and your continuity plans. What does that look like? Who needs to be involved? Cyber in your IT, your network is very much should be a conversation about that, because everything is done online now. Everything's done on the TV, all of those things. Our church has a big TV up there, our slides are up there, all of that stuff. And then conduct your vulnerability assessments to really understand what your risks are. Get on those mailing lists that everybody's mentioned tonight. Go out to our website, start really signing up for those alerts and those awareness bulletins so you have a good idea of what's going on. And then really just training your community for readiness and resilience. Establishing that culture in your organization of caring about what all the members are doing, visitors, who's being supported, what are credible threats, what you should do if there's a credible threat during one of your services, and also applying physical and cyber measures. I mentioned earlier that they kind of go hand in hand. Cyber can definitely cause physical effects to your facility, and a physical breach or physical incident can also cause a cyber effect as well. And then, like Joy mentioned, focus on the safety of the children, implementing safe practices, whether you take pictures of the kids, like again at our church, ours is all digital, signing the kids in, it has a picture of them. So, how are you going to protect those children's information identity? And then really implementing the cyber best practices and safeguarding the importance of their information. Next slide, please. So ransomware, I mentioned it several times, but that's our number one enemy. Ransomware is malicious software that will encrypt and lock your data. This is the majority of what we see. We've seen this several times in Wyoming. As a part of that response team I mentioned earlier, we've responded to assist in this several times. But this is typically what will pop up on the screen, and then everything is encrypted. Some cyber criminals are just so sweet that once they encrypt all your information and you pay them or you want them to pay them, they will work with you to get your information back, and they'll tell you how to unencrypt it. But you're going to pay them a lot of money. And so this again is just, I wanted you guys to see what this looks like. This is always an important piece of information, kind of like what Scott was talking about in the bombing prevention. This is something that should be preserved as well. You can send it, report it. When you report it to FBI, I have some other links. They're going to want a copy of this because it has valuable information, IP addresses, different information that forensics can be done on to help locate who that actor is. Next slide, please. Again, ransomware is reported to CISA from December of 21 to June of 23. I put some red circles around commercial facilities. That's where House of Worships fall in our 16 critical infrastructure sectors. We've had about 171 reported during that time, and that's to all commercial facilities. So think hospitals, clinics, I guess not hospitals are in their own healthcare sector, but different types of facilities, businesses would fall into that area. Next slide, please. And then taking a more proactive approach, leveraging your threats and consequences and information. What is your vulnerability exposure? And so really just being proactive and working through that process to help reduce that cyber risk, training your office staff on what to look for in emails, and how to report that and who to work with when they see something suspicious. Next slide, please. And best practices of cyber hygiene. These are things that you guys can do every day to help protect your facility. Password phrases. You know, it used to just be people do 1, 2, 3, password 1, 2, 3, 4. But make it a complex password phrase. Multi-factor authentication, if you can enable this whenever possible. It can, you know, I'll pick on my mom for a minute. She thinks it's absolutely annoying that she has to do multi-factor, but I always tell her you got to do it. You got to do it. We're keeping you safe. And always enable that. It is an extra step. It can sometimes be a pain if you forget your password and you reset everything, but it's definitely another way to keep you safe, because the bad actors, if they get your password, but you have that multi-factor authentication set on, then it'll text you, hey, this code, and that code is going to go to you, not to the bad actor. So if you all of a sudden get that text code and you're not logging in to say your Amazon account, you know somebody might be trying to get into your Amazon account. It's time to change your password. Don't reuse passwords. Pick a different password. Don't use anything that's identifiable to, you know, your cat's name or your best friend's name or where you grew up with or your phone number, anything like that. Try to make those passphrases complex, but complex enough that you can remember them. And then some other ones, outside support. Do you have an outside support? Do you have a third-party vendor that helps manage your network system? What does their response look like? You know, have you had a conversation with them of if they get compromised, what does that do to your guys' system, and how can they help protect you? And when are they going to notify you if they have an issue in their systems? Next slide, please. And then, like always, some great CISA resources. Here's a list of resources that you can go to find out more about what we talked about. Our Shields Up website, Stop Ransomware. Our Cyber Resource Hub is a very great tool. So there's a lot of great resources and tools out on CISA's website. Next slide. And then incident reporting. So who do you call? You can call FBI or report it to their CyWatch. There's the Secret Service. They do some financial fraud investigation. I have our Wyoming State Fusion Center on there, but if you need any assistance getting a hold of your Fusion Center in your respective state, reach out. Tim has the list that he could provide to you on how to get a hold of them. And then definitely report to CISA Central. You can call them, email them. And then again, to report an internet crime, there's the ice.gov for FBI's website as well. Next slide. So again, prioritize your cybersecurity. Is even for small facilities all the way up to really large facilities. Our resources are always available. They're free. We would love to come out and have a conversation with you guys and help you make a plan and get started on a good cyber hygiene path. And would love to support in any exercises or anything that you guys may need. Next slide. And again, thank you for spending a couple hours of your evening with us, and we hope you found all of this information valuable.
Well, thank you, Mickey. We had a few questions and comments come up in chat during the presentation. One was related to size of organizations that can use this as assessments. Is there a limit to the size, as in too small of a facility or organization?
No.
Okay.
All is welcome.
And then a question about posting safety and security policies and those type of documents online. Is there a way to share them with a smaller team, or recommendations on how to do that safely?
We were just actually talking about this today. I mean, and I know there's another cybersecurity advisor or coordinator on here too, so feel free to jump in, Jim. But you know, I think if it's a general policy, but if it is how you are going to respond to something and the details, like I would not post that online. If you have a share drive that is limited to that specific security team and they're the only ones that have access to it because everybody else is blocked from it, that's a good way to share it. Or if you have a folder that everybody has, like a desktop, a password to get into it. But if you have how you're going to respond to things, all of your processes, your techniques, procedures, everything. I would not make that public. You can make a list of who's like on your safety team if you wanted to post it on your website, but you could definitely share it within that smaller group. Like I said, if it's on a shared drive or if you just email it to that specific group, is always an option as well.
There was a mention of a virtual credit card or payment system to eliminate the actual exchange of account numbers on websites. So there's a lot of tools and resources like that, I'm sure. And a question about apps available to keep passwords safe, if they're indeed safe apps to use.
We actually had this conversation yesterday. I'm not an iPhone person, so I don't know if there's any specific for iPhone, but there are a lot of people who do use paid password protection apps. However, some of those have been victims of compromise. So I think, like one of my coworkers, he's like, I have a folder, but it's password protected with all my passwords on it. Like I know I'm an Android user, so I know like my Samsung one, it has one that you can utilize that will save like your last password, what you did, or if you updated your password, and it'll save it that way. But I think that's a very, that's up to you on if you want to use those paid ones.
Yeah, hey,
you
Mickey,
know,
this is
yeah.
Mickey, this is Sean. This is
Yeah.
where I would kind of come in and talk a little bit more about with the password, also adding that multi-factor authentication, right? So whether you're using a password generator or a password saver, if that's your decision to use to avoid having to write it down, great. But if you have the multi-factor authentication and you get that text message, even if your password generator is compromised, you've got another method of securing that. So again, I would recommend everybody, even on my personal laptop where it asks me, do you want me to remember this browser? I always say no and go through the process of having the additional text message with the number for that multi-factor because it's just that additional level of security. So I think that's probably the best method to ensure you're more secure there.
Yep. And then biometrics too on your phone. Like I have a couple different apps that when I log into them, I have to put in my thumbprint. And so, that's another, just exactly like what Sean said, that's another way of my multi-factor. It's just not putting in a number, but it's my thumbprint as well. So there's a lot of options that you can do to keep your information safe.
All right, thank you very much. There's a reminder as well about a quick reporting of a cyber incident, CISA.gov/report. And that's a good summary. I don't hear you see any other additional questions in the chat. Does anyone like to come off mute to ask? Okay, well, thank you, Mickey, and appreciate the presentation. I'll just highlight again, I posted this in the chat already on a couple occasions, but there are some summary general faith-based resources available from the CISA Region 8 site, including a recent blog that a lot of the resources are linked from as we look at the as that particular page. I know it was already mentions about exercise support, but I'll hit it again on the CISA Tabletop Exercise Package program that has specific faith-based scenarios that is really a good resource to download, and it gives you tabletop exercises in a box that you can develop and test the plans that we've discussed in that whole process, bring it to a good conclusion and evaluate how you're doing. With that, I did want to thank our presenters for today and for all those that attended. And before we depart, I'll turn it back over to our Regional Director, Sean Graff, for some closing remarks.
Yeah, hey, great. I'll make this quick. Thanks, Tim, and thanks to the presenters. We promised 120 minutes of good chocolatey goodness for your taxpayers' resources, and I think that's what we provided tonight. I would just say we offered a lot of options and a lot of resources, and you may be swimming with information, please reach out to us. We have advisors like Mickey and Jory and others that presented tonight that live and work in your community and can help you navigate these resources and navigate any of the risks or concerns that you may have. So we've got that contact information. Reach out to us, and we will respond and do what we can to help you help make our nation and our infrastructure more secure. So thanks for hanging in there with us. Good luck and be safe out there.
Thank you, Sean. And we do have some other contact information on these slides that I'll share. And additionally, we have some upcoming events that will be shared as well when I send the email out. They're also in the chat with a way to look at our upcoming Securing Public Gatherings webinar and other events on our Eventbrite page. Thank you.